Hi there. How are you doing? Hope you're having a great day. Today, we're diving into a topic that still blows the minds of many historians. We're used to hearing about the Weimar Republic as something doomed, a failed experiment that logically and sadly came to an end. But is that really the case? Let's dig deep today properly with feeling and take our time. I promise this story will be long, like a breadline during the hungry years, but as interesting as the most daring Berlin cabaret. So get comfortable, pour yourself some tea or something stronger, we're traveling back in time. Friends, if this topic resonates with you, if you want more deep dives into history like this, subscribe to the channel and be sure to write in the comments what you think. Your opinion matters to me. Let's go. When I started looking into this question, was the Weimar Republic a failed state? I immediately remembered one story. Picture December 5, 1930. Germany. The Berlin premiere of the film All Quiet on the Western Front, based on Erich Maria Remarque's novel. The movie was already hailed as a masterpiece worldwide, but in Germany itself, things went sideways from the very first minutes. Joseph Goebbels, the top Nazi propagandist, demonstratively stood up and left the hall. And that was the signal. Chaos erupted. White mice, smoke bombs, itching powder were released into the theater. Fights broke out between protesters and the audience. Police with batons waded in. Total mayhem. Then came 4 days of protests across the country. And in the end, the censors banned the film, citing that it damages Germany's prestige. This is a snapshot of the Republic in cross-section. On one hand, great art. On the other, wild obscurantism and political pressure. On one hand, freedom of speech and creativity. On the other, street gangs dictating what could and couldn't be watched. And you get the feeling that this state was simply being torn apart. And when we hear Weimar Republic, many of us picture exactly that. Avant-garde art, cabarets, devalued money being hauled around in wheelbarrows, and street fights between communists and Nazis. A wild cocktail, right? But the problem is, this image is too one-sided. It's like judging a person by one drunken photo from a party. Yes, that happened, but there was so much more. In the shadow of Versailles and fear. Let's be clear from the start. The Weimar Republic was born in 1919 under extremely unpleasant conditions. Germany had lost World War I, the Kaiser had fled, the country was in ruins. And the Entente, the victors, said, "We will only deal with a democratic government." So, democracy was essentially imposed on the Germans from the outside. This caused internal rejection right from the start. Then came the Treaty of Versailles. Just think about these figures. Germany was stripped of 13% of its territory. The army was reduced to a measly 100,000 men. Aviation and tanks were banned outright. And on top of that, they were saddled with reparations, 132 billion gold marks. This wasn't just robbery. It was economic genocide. British Prime Minister Lloyd George wisely said at the time, "We are pushing the Germans into the arms of the extremists." And he was spot on. The Germans didn't accept this humiliation. They didn't see themselves as guilty for starting the war, and Versailles became a symbol of national shame. But the most interesting part is that despite this heavy burden, the Republic didn't just survive. It tried to live, and to live vibrantly. Women, freedom, and a German-style sexual revolution. Imagine Germany in the 1920s. Few men remained after the war. An entire generation had been wiped out on the battlefields. Women outnumbered men. And this changed everything. If before, a woman's primary role was wife and mother, now many simply couldn't find a husband. They had to find themselves elsewhere. And the state gave them that chance. On November 12, 1918, even before the Constitution was adopted, women over 20 gained equal voting rights. By 1927, 35 women were serving as deputies in the Reichstag. This was a breakthrough. In Britain at that time, only 4 women were elected to the House of Commons in 1924. Can you imagine the scale of the difference? Women went to work. They became secretaries, saleswomen, and worked in industry. They had their own money, financial independence from parents and husbands. Companies quickly realized this was a new golden consumer market and started advertising everything, from lipstick to vacuum cleaners, specifically targeting women. Morals changed too. Competition for the scarce men forced women to be more active, bolder. They started taking the initiative themselves. And with this came sexual freedom. Parliament seriously discussed legalizing prostitution and repealing the infamous paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexual acts. Authorities essentially turned a blind eye. And what do we see? Berlin in the 1920s became a true mecca for the LGBTQ+ community. 26 magazines for gay men and lesbians were published. There were an estimated 65 to 80 bars catering to a homosexual clientele and 50 clubs just for lesbians. We're used to this kind of thing now, but back then it was incredible. It was a genuine cultural and social revolution, ahead of its time by half a century. So much for a failed state. In matters of gender equality and sexual tolerance, Weimar was ahead of almost the entire world. Of course, this enraged conservatives, right-wingers, and nationalists. They cried about moral decay, about German culture perishing under the onslaught of Americanization and debauchery. Cartoons of the time are filled with images of new women, with short haircuts and short skirts, smoking cigarettes in public. For some, this was a symbol of freedom. For others, a symbol of degradation. But this was precisely the essence of Weimar. This eternal conflict between old and new, a battle fought on all fronts, from the parliament to the bedroom. Cabaret on the volcano. Those cabarets. When people talk about the golden 20s, they immediately imagine smoky halls, jazz, scantily clad dancers, and witty MCs joking about politicians. After decades of strict censorship under the Kaiser, where any free word could lead to trouble, an era of freedom had arrived. And the Germans went all out. Weimar Cabaret wasn't just about stripping and drinking. It was a political platform. Comedians mocked everyone. President Ebert, they loved to joke about his physique, Parliament, the army, and later Hitler, too. Remember the popular song of the time, Das ist alles Schwindel? It's all a swindle. The lyrics went something like, politicians are magicians who make fraud disappear. The bribes they take, the deals they make, will never reach the public's ears. Everyone cheats a little. So vote for the one who'll steal for you. This isn't just a song. It's a diagnosis of society. People saw everything, understood everything, but felt powerless. And the cabaret reflected this powerlessness, mixed with desperation and the desire to live one last day beautifully. The historian Stefan Zweig, a witness to that era, wrote, Berlin had been transformed into the Babylon of the world. The Germans brought to perversion all their ardor and love of system. Painted boys with artificial waists promenade along the Kurfürstendamm. Even Rome had not known orgies like the Berlin transvestite balls. Harsh, right? But that's the conservative view. Another view was that this was, finally, the breath of freedom. The problem was that many Germans, especially the older generation and rural dwellers, looked upon all this with horror. For them, Berlin wasn't the world's capital, but the capital of vice. And the Nazis, incidentally, very skillfully exploited this discontent, promising to restore purity to German culture and morals. Economy, gold on blood. Now let's talk about money, because it's not all about culture. People always need to eat. The early 1920s saw hyperinflation that became a textbook example. 1923 was a nightmare. On January 3rd, a kilo of bread cost 163 marks. By October 1st, it was 10 million. People were paid in suitcases full of cash and would run to the store because prices could rise again within an hour. Ilya Ehrenberg, who visited Berlin then, described it, shop owners changed price tags daily. The mark was falling. Herds of foreigners roamed the Kurfürstendamm. They were buying up remnants of former luxury for pennies. In poor neighborhoods, several bakeries were looted. But here's the interesting part. The Republic managed to claw its way back. Gustav Stresemann came in, introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, and negotiated with foreign powers. The Dawes Plan, 1924, and the Young Plan, 1929, gave Germany a breather. The Americans pumped a huge amount of money into the German economy. 800 million gold marks under the Dawes Plan alone. And growth began. Industry recovered. By 1928, industrial production exceeded pre-war 1913 levels. Exports grew, wages rose too. The IG Farben conglomerate became the largest chemical company in Europe. It seemed like a time to live and be happy. But there was one problem. This whole prosperity was built on American loans. As soon as the Great Depression hit the US in 1929, those loans dried up and Germany collapsed again. Unemployment skyrocketed. And that's when people forgot about cabarets and freedom and remembered they had nothing to eat. And this is a crucial point. When people have no jobs and don't know how to feed their kids, they don't care about democracy. They need someone who will feed them. The German journalist Joseph Roth wrote prophetic words in the 1920s. If the devil himself appeared now with a hearty stew cooked in hellfire, just to feed the starving of Germany, this diabolical concoction of his would be a holy cause. And when that devil appeared in 1933, many wanted his stew, not thinking about the consequences. Political struggle, democracy with fists. Now for politics, we're often shown the Weimar Republic as weak, indecisive, constantly falling apart. But that's not true. It was, as historians call it, a militant democracy. In 1922, the law for the protection of the Republic was passed, allowing the banning of anti-republican organizations. The state had tools for self-defense. Voter turnout was high. Political life was vibrant. Yes, governments changed frequently, but key figures, like Stresemann himself, remained at the helm for years. Until 1929, democratic parties enjoyed popular support. Even the German National People's Party, which was anti-republican, was twice persuaded to join the government, in 1925 and 1927 to 1928, and they agreed. So the system worked. But there was a problem: the proportional representation electoral system. It allowed even small parties to enter parliament. The Nazis and the communists took advantage of this. Although even at the peak of the crisis in the early 1930s, they couldn't get a majority. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazis got 37% of the vote, and the communists about 14%. Together, that's over half. But these were two parties that hated each other more than they hated the existing government. Democratic parties still had a chance to unite and block the extremists, but they couldn't agree. Research by modern historians, like Eduard Schultz, shows that the Republic's collapse wasn't due to some innate weakness, but to specific political miscalculations and shifts in voter preferences. The main condition for stability was the support of the SPD as the largest party. But in 1932, the NSDAP snatched the role of the National Party from the Social Democrats, managing to unite voters from different social groups under its umbrella. The Nazis offered the idea of a people's community, Volksgemeinschaft, which proved very attractive during the crisis. And this brings us to the most interesting part. The Weimar Republic lasted 14 years. That's longer than many think. And all that time, it wasn't just surviving. It was creating something new. It was the first to introduce women's suffrage, the first to give the green light to sexual minorities, the first to create a system of social security, pensions, unemployment benefits, health insurance. Many of the social reforms we now take for granted first appeared there. Yes, the cultural life of Weimar was incredibly rich. But there was another side to the coin, the so-called moral concern of conservatives. They saw this freedom as decay. And when the crisis hit, they said, "We told you so. Democracy leads to debauchery and chaos." And here's where I want us to think. Aren't we oversimplifying? History textbooks often present the Weimar Republic as a direct path to Hitler, like it was all predetermined and democracy failed. But that's not true. Historians like Colin Storer mentioned at the beginning call for a reassessment. Yes, the Republic fell. Yes, the Nazis came to power. It's a tragedy for Germany and the world. But we mustn't forget that before that, there were 14 years when people were building a new society. There were ups and downs, successes and failures. There was art that still amazes us. There were women who felt free for the first time. There were gay men and lesbians who could live openly. There were social reforms that protected the poor. All of this happened, and it cannot be erased. You cannot reduce the history of an entire era to how it ended. You have to remember what it was. And lastly, the Weimar Republic didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it was hit by a perfect storm: the global economic crisis, years of nationalist propaganda, the communist threat, the fear of the conservative elite, and the unwillingness of democratic parties to unite in the face of common danger. It was a combination of factors, not a fatal inevitability. So, answering the question, was the Weimar Republic a failed state? I'd say this: no, it wasn't. It was a state that succeeded in many ways, but was unlucky with circumstances and couldn't defend itself against enemies both outside and within. If you found this interesting, if you learned something new and want more deep dives like this into history, be sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments. Do you think democracy in Germany could have survived if not for the Great Depression? Did it have a chance? Let's talk.